Welcome to Acid Horizon, the Theory podcast. Today we're going to be discussing the theory and indeed the philosophy of queerness, the relation of queerness to norms and normativity, to the body, and to the politics that may arise out of it in a time of engaging in increasing fascist attacks on queer life and liberty in the Anglophone world and beyond. And to discuss this matter, I am joined by longtime friends of the show, Billie Cashmore and Mattie Colquhoun, and we're going to talk about particularly Billie's essay on the political character of queerness and Mattie's response to this, and kind of an ongoing back and forth in the Horntology of transness or wither gender accelerationism. But we will not be discussing any kind of black papers or black pilling today. Mattie and Billie, thank you so much for joining me.
I'm so happy to be here, Adam. Just for the listener, me and Mattie sat across each other, each reclined effectively on a sofa, and I'm drinking a glass of red wine. So this is going to have a specific vibe, I think, as a discussion.
The wine mums are in.
Yeah, exactly.
I have a coffee mug full of water, so I don't know what that makes me, but we're there.
We're there.
Let's just kick off from the theory part proper. I just wanted to ask, in the most general sense, I mean, both of your work comes out of a theoretical tradition of queer theory, particularly coming around from theorists like Judith Butler, that thinks about queerness, particularly in terms of the destabilization of norms of heterosexuality, heteronormativity, as it's called, patriarchal norms, and indeed norms of the gender binary as such. Could we just unpack this concept of queerness and how it arises as a particular theoretical object of discussion from this tradition?
Yeah, I can have a go. So maybe to start off, I think that part of what I'm trying to do here is think about queerness as more historically specific and to an extent recent than, it might sometimes be used. So at least in part, if I'm talking about the concept of queerness today and sort of generally, I tend to mean something which conforms this particular political logic. And that logic runs maybe something like this. I would imagine that most listeners are familiar in some way with Butler's concept of performativity, but I wonder exactly in what sense they're familiar with the way in which queerness is meant to enter into their philosophy. Because in a way, queerness only comes slightly after gender trouble, right, in the last essay of Bodies That Matter. But let's have a go. So if all gender is the result of a performative act, that is to say, a performative speech act in the kind of Derridian-ish, Austinian sense, then all gender performance and all gendered acts involve a kind of an instantiation of a symbolic order that it is in some way that performative act is in some way indexed that symbolic order, but also constitutive of it. And the idea is that there is always in some way, by virtue of the performative dimension of that act, the fact that it constitutes the very thing that it is said to be reflective of, there is therefore in the performance of all gendered acts something necessarily subversive. This is why kind of really the key concept in gender trouble is subversion rather than queerness. But the way that queerness eventually entered effectively is that element in all gendered performance, which is against the heterosexual matrix, something like this. So the ways in which all gendered acts fail. And those which are read to be queer performances are said to be kind of failed performances, failed femininities, failed masculinities. And there is therefore queerness for Butler becomes, and I argue this in the piece, effectively an element in all performative action. And when I say for Butler, I mean just for a small section of their work at the beginning of the 90s, right? I'm not really attributing this to them currently, but this is the way that I read those few texts. And what I think that this does, and I think the way that this has been taken up in kind of common parlance, or rather, I should say, a parlance which is allied to a particular kind of politics, kind of just general progressive queer politics in the West, is that queerness, therefore, is able to be ascribed to an increasing number of actions, include, generally speaking, gendered actions, but not, I would suggest, limited to them. And in so doing, it sort of furnishes a kind of politics with a kind of radical inclusivity by which queerness is no longer identified as a particular identity, but rather in some ways as the condition of possibility for any identity claim. Therefore, queerness is able to enter at this quite a kind of quasi-ontological level, wherein prior to any determination of a particular identity, there is this destabilizing act of this destabilizing feature of the action, which is named queerness. This is, maybe we'll talk about it a bit later, but this is in some ways kind of connected to the politics of solidarity, which is so kind of commonplace in organizing spaces and academic spaces, theory spaces, para-academic, and sort of it's basically everywhere, I think, which is all broadly based around this kind of increasingly horizontalizing understanding of queerness. And part of what I was talking about in that essay is maybe to start thinking about calling that structure of argument into question, because I was beginning to find it somewhat unconvincing.
One of the ways in which you sort of do end up tackling sort of the unconvincingness on it is on the level of ontology. And I think that's also one place where both of your respective works end up tackling this question of queerness. So I just want to throw an open one out there. I mean, what is the relationship of queerness to ontology in terms of, does discourse itself become reduced to ontology when we talk about, the idea of queering as a discursive function in very, of academic papers, or just, queer discourse generally? When you talk about, for example, the idea of queerness being sort of the condition of the impossibility, or the condition of possibility for like so-called normal identities, which also becomes the impossibility of their ever being fulfilled. No one ever fully embodies a normative position, and then the ways in which we are different from that constitutes, at least in the eyes of the norm, a kind of failure to be quote unquote normal or normative. How do you both think this relates to the concept of ontology, about the idea of being? Is there a queerness of being, or is there a being queer? Is there a becoming queer?
I might just quickly say something. So I'm being kind of cruel in that in the essay called On the Political Character of Queerness, because I've been slightly accused of having only a hammer so that everything looks like a nail about this. But I sort of tend to think that the post-68 moment in French philosophy that Judith Butler emerges out of, although not entirely out of, I accept that, is at least in part, or is it at sort of all of its various moments, more or less Heideggerian. And the reason that therefore I start talking about this ontology of queerness, not as something because this is something that I think Butler writes about, but because I think there is something about the structure of that argument which mirrors Heidegger's concept of the ontological difference between beings, right? So that would be something like individuated things or objects. Things would be a problematic term, at least in the later Heidegger, but maybe not so much in Being and Time. And being as such, where being, with a capital B, would be the proper investigation, or the proper subject of investigation for philosophy. And I don't necessarily want to spend a lot of time tracking how I think this gets filtered through to Butler's thought, but take it something like where queerness no longer is something which you are, right? It's something that you do, right? That sounds quite good, right? That sounds almost quasi-pragmatist. That's the sort of thing that quite a lot of us could get on board with, because it means that we seem to be no longer be limited by these identities, which tend to end up being exclusive, right? We sort of end up saying that someone's not sufficiently queer, and that tends to sort of track particular power dynamics. But I would suggest that there is a kind of ontology of queerness operating insofar as queerness itself is meant to be prior to the determination of queer people. So queerness is taking on something like that role of being prior to the determination of beings, right? The kind of the ontological as opposed to the ontic for those Heideggerians out there. And I think that Butler's doing something similar. Now, I don't like Heidegger very much, so that's why it's cruel, because I think this is quite problematic. I think there's a lot of good critical, progressive, Marxist critiques of Heidegger. for all of his various uses and abuses in the history in 20th century thought, I think that ultimately, for my money, it ends up being at the very least a conservative tendency in philosophy, and occasionally slightly more than conservative, let's say. And I think that if it's true, and I think it is true, that this greatly influenced the structure of queer theory, which has then filtered through in various ways into our thinking about queer politics more generally, I think that is a problem, because I think that it leaves in place certain kind of considerations of authenticity and inauthenticity that ought to be got rid of in favor of a kind of, in some kind of radically inauthentic inhabitation of history. But that would be my sort of rather winding answer to that.
I suppose that my approach to this was not so much, I think it's a question of clarity, is I don't know whether I do or do not agree with you.
Yeah.
And I think I really enjoyed reading your essay. And I think I said this in my response piece, and I by no means meant it as a sort of, as a negative. I found it, and I think I remember telling you this, I found it very difficult, and I found it very rewarding, because I guess this is just maybe my thing in general, is that I don't feel as fluent in a lot of this language, but then it's a way of trying to work through to see how your argument is present, maybe at a level of a kind of pop cultural discourse, which I think is like kind of can easily become apparent. And maybe this is interesting again for listeners and things, of like, talking about the difference between ontological and meontic, or this the being and beings. And I guess that there's like that you go to any, especially right now in the UK, you go to any kind of protest that is trying to fight against the more recent like Supreme Court judgment, or any kind of protest that's trying to bolster the sort of fundamentals of trans rights. You do get these sort of strange, for a philosopher anyway, or someone trained in philosophy, you get these strange sort of tensions that are produced. And I guess one that I sort of always, have since thought about since reading your piece, and I thought about it again from what you just said, is, well, yes, you have this horizontal version of, I don't even know if you can call it understanding, but a sort of position in relation to queerness that is very, I think we call it like a radical inclusivity, that can slip into a kind of universalism. And then at the same time, you have sort of the rebuttal to a lot of what has been sort of legally related to the legal suppression of trans people's right to exist, is you just get the sort of short rebuttal of trans people do exist.
Yes.
And immediately there's like a kind of, I don't know if it's necessarily a contradiction, but it's like, okay, well, if trans people exist, and we can all agree on that point, how do they exist? And how does that, and maybe, again, this is maybe blurring into that kind of ontological question. If trans people exist, what are the maybe material ways of defining that socially, or I mean, maybe these are the questions, but like, if trans people exist, how do they exist? And how does making that argument of the specificities of trans experience start to then unravel this radical inclusivity, where those specificities start to fall by the wayside?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think that part of the conversation that I think has been quite good about sort of the response to the Supreme Court judgment is the ways in which the language of trans misogyny specifically, and the discussions of trans misogyny, have started to reinsert themselves. Because there's this kind of strange thing, which, for kind of the Hegelians out there won't seem so strange, where this kind of like absolute assertion of the particularity of queerness, it's kind of radical non-embodiment of various norms, or it's kind of consistent failure in all these ways, actually just becomes this kind of weird universalism. And wherein, which is exactly as you're right, the kind of, which is sort of strangely unaware of dealing with the particularities or the specifics, as you say, of that experience. And I certainly wrote, I mean, most of my writing comes out of frustration, I suppose, but this was, it was something like a refrain, right? Which was, queer people have always existed, and I got really interested in that claim and the claim that queerness is inherently political. Those can't both be true.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. Because if queerness is meant to be this kind of condition of possibility of signification itself, which I think, where it's sort of lying, and I think it sort of has to be that if you think that it's inherently destabilizing, right? So the inherent politics I take it, meant to be an anti-patriarchal politics generally, although via a kind of particular odd reading of intersectionality, that's going to be enough for everything. I imagine we'll talk about that. But I would say that for a long time we had lost the ways in which one of the key learnings of kind of early intersectionality, which was that particular subject positions could not be accurately described from the perspective of any particular political dynamic, right? So, I mean, at least part of the way that I would read something like the Combahee River Collective statement is actually that there is something about Black lesbianism which cannot be understood from the perspective of either merely white supremacy or homophobia or misogyny. And I would take it, therefore, that the assertion of the inherent political character of any of those identities, therefore, does, in a sense, a disservice to the actual constitution of those identities and the ways, therefore, in which they could become political. Yeah. Something like the proclamation of the inherent political character of them actually does quite the opposite. It makes them impossible to be political. They might be necessarily social, but the social and the political aren't the same. They're not like, the political is, in a way, kind of the sort of the temporary suspension of the social as a moment of its transformation. But I'm rambling. I think, but yeah, I also don't know how much I agree with myself, so that's fine. Yeah. I mean, I wrote it on a Ryanair flight on the way, probably slightly hungover. So it's certainly not kind of like a final say or anything, not particularly claiming any authority, or at least not too much, but yeah.
That's the eternal struggle. I don't agree with myself from 6 months ago on my blog, nor have I ever. It's like that's a sliding scale.
Yeah.
Wherever you're at. I guess maybe partly one thing, and I mean, if that's kind of another way that I thought of framing maybe what this problem is, again, just kind of trying to sort of filter's the wrong word, but I guess pass your argument through the arsenal that I already have in terms of like the ever-present theoretical reference points or whatever. And I mean, maybe this is something that's already there in Butler anyways, Butler being sort of so influenced by Derrida.
Yeah.
But yeah, I guess for me it was this, I wondered what potential there was to think then that through this notion of a kind of queer or trans ontology, or if the question is if it's sort of what it is, I mean, this is where my sort of actual fluency in this terminology will start to fail me, but if we're sort of talking, if this ontologizing of queerness, and do correct me if this is not your understanding from writing the essay, but if this ontology of queerness is about how trans people present and are present and exist, and how you define that presence, and then there's this other side of queerness that is sort of more of a more unstable, more kind of in and out of phase, this literal spectre of a kind of subject that is kind of undefinable, or at least resists easy categorization in this symbolic order. And I guess that's one way you put it, right? The gender is for whose gender? No, what was what I mean?
Gender is what is it? Gender is a conditional possibility for signification, something like that.
Or no, queerness. Is it queer? Queerness is to be queer is to the person whose gender is in question.
So
it's yeah. So I've got the quote.
The queer gender is that gender for whom its gender is in question. I mean, but that is me being extreme. That's me. That's exactly the position that I am trying to oppose.
Right.
Because that's so Dasein for Heidegger is the being for whom being is in question.
Yeah.
And so there was, the fact that, this idea of I got quite obsessed with this idea of like gender questioning at one point, as you can imagine, as like a particular expression, because to suggest that anyone else was certain about their gender seemed to be quite an odd one.
I did obsess with that too. But that was kind of like, that was my egg starting to crack.
Yes, many such cases.
Yes, sure. So it's kind of is useful for that. But I guess then it's if there's a way of but I guess my question was, what does a hauntology of queerness look like, where it is this, if it's this thing that's not quite so present it doesn't have a presence in ways that are kind of privileged by this by a symbolic order that is kind of like the thing that is trying to be eluded, and it's this phasing in and out of whether that's can constitute that, but then that's sort of me trying to frame it in a way as someone who remains, despite all better judgment, something of an accelerationist. Thinking about that history of like, where hauntology becomes, for someone like Alex Williams in this cultural context of Mark Fisher, Simon Reynolds, etc., becomes a kind of good postmodernism, where it kind of becomes sort of productive version of the thing that it's actually opposed to. And how do you make this position of undecidability productive? But then there's and that's kind of the point that my response to your essay ended at. But then I think, even from what we've already said, this sort of interest in the undecidable, maybe that is too a kind of the opposite, that being the thing you also oppose.
I think for me, it's not that I think that queerness is stable, that we should just be looking for this one accurate understanding of transness or queerness. It's, at least in part, what I'm trying to say is that destabilization is not as unstable as it likes to think. Quite often. I maybe to give another way of putting this, it's not dissimilar to my problem with someone like Deleuze. So I would take it that Deleuze's philosophy and politics can, in many ways, be configured quite simply as a critique of representation. I think this is true of, and it's not a critique in the Kantian sense of a critique of representation. It's a sense that actually the very problematic of how to represent the world, represent yourselves, represent the proletariat in that. Oh, Adam, what's the Foucault-Deleuze conversation? Intellectuals and power?
Intellectuals and power, yes.
Yeah, that's the one. Where, the question, the workers don't need representing, they represent themselves. And actually, that's not the best way of putting it, because I think the whole point is that, you shouldn't be thinking about representation at all. That's one way of thinking about the whole rejigging of metaphysics around stratification in 1,000 plateaus or anything like this. It really should be understood as a way of kind of recovering some sense of subjectivity and objectivity after the Heideggerian critique of this idea that there's this world that you can either represent yourselves or not, right? My thing is that you're not getting out of representation that easy. I don't love representation either, but it's not there. Brassier says as much as this in an essay called Concrete Rules and Abstract Machines, in a collection called 1,000 Plateaus in Philosophy. And I think it's a really good argument. It's a really excellent essay, that. And I think in some ways, but then if you go, so I think Deleuze has this quite extended critique of representation, but then actually when you end up looking at his sort of moments of his political expression, representation always basically comes back to bite him in the arse, or something like a transparent political subject ends up being kind of re-imported. I mean, this is that. So, for example, in the Cinema books, which is one of the few places where he actually tells you what you should do, he says you should just tell your own story. Right? There's this like politics of truth and speaking truth, which actually comes in the late Foucault as well. Sorry, Will. And this is basically Spivak's critique. All right, that basically is ultimately, in Can the Subaltern Speak, reaffirms the fact that actually you can't represent yourself, but also or political identities, subjugated political identities cannot be represented that doesn't mean that you're out of the problem of representation. It's rather that you should be attempting to represent their unrepresentability.
Yes.
And I think this is where we're going to find a point of agreement between us, because my problem isn't with, I suppose, any particular representation of queerness. My problem is with this structure of argument that I think attempts to kind of sidestep this whole problem of representation. And actually, like, I don't know how. I think that you end up settling down into certain representations of non-representational activity that tend to end up becoming quite ahistorical. And I think that in a way is what's happened to queerness. Like, speaking as a queer person, there's ways that queer people dress. And there always have been, and there always will be, and these will change through various times, but we will all be sort of attempting to represent this fact that we can't be represented to discourse. And if there is a radical truth in Butler, and actually, well, there are many, but one of them is that fact that queerness is never present. And Derrida, right, in a way is coming, there will be this kind of agreement between the Derridian problematic of ontology and what I'm trying to get at here, which is this kind of aporia of representation, which is like all through spectres of Marx and unsurprisingly can subaltern speak and so on. My brain is going to, and I know we sort of spoke beforehand about whether we broached the topic or not, but my brain is going to Lacan here, and also to Deleuze, but I don't know if Adam has any interjection before I kind of take that tangent.
Well, no, I mean, this is exactly kind of the sort of conversation I wanted to help facilitate, honestly. I mean, in terms of I guess in terms of how I understand it in terms of a universalism, it seems to be kind of a negative universalism insofar as these are all, as you're saying, that these are all the moments that queerness presents itself as all the moments of what is unrepresentable, where it kind of presents itself as kind of almost pure particularity, is that this is the thing that is missed by every universal. The map is not the territory and we're always the territory, but we're going to map out all the ways that the map does not interact with the territory.
Yeah, but it's also missed by all particularities, Adam. It's also missed by all particularities, right? So also the territory isn't the map or something like this. I don't know. Like I mean, because in the claim the map isn't the territory, you imagine that you have a territory that you can look at. And there is no territory of queerness, right? I mean, that would be far too positivistic and would take those as given, I think. And so I think my sense would be, it's not merely, I mean, and also just before, anything that I would never claim to say what I think queerness is, right? All I'm trying to say is that I think that we ought to be a little bit more critical of this specific structure of argument. And a structure of argument that I actually think I certainly for a long time took on as a way of thinking about myself. And I actually don't think it's as productive for those who have heretofore called ourselves queer. And I'm not gonna sit here and say you can't call yourself queer because that's too Heideggerian. That's something I might say is ironically as a joke, but of course that's not what I mean. It's just that I feel like Mattie has something to say about Lacan, so I'm going to let her do that.
Well, it's also the just the map is on the territory, which is like kind of a good. Maybe it's a surprisingly good example of what you're talking about earlier, not being able to escape representation. Because the thing that I always think about now, since I went back and read I never know the person, Alfred Korzybski. That phrase comes from his books Science and Sanity, I think. But the full quote never gets quoted, which is a map is not the territory it represents, but if correct, it has a similar structure to the territory, which accounts for its usefulness.
Yeah, very good.
And I guess that's where that inescapability of representation comes in.
Yeah.
And this is also, I guess, but it's the problem of what to do with that and how. I mean, it becomes contextual. The people load the first part of that quote because it kind of it shows that there is a problem. Sort of at two ends. It's like it can account for its usefulness, but but that becomes contextual because the map, not depending on what you want to do, you need different kinds of map and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think so. Although there's a sense in which that kind of the map territory relation often becomes reducible to questions of use.
Yes.
And I wonder whether that specific configuration of the problematic might end up talking about useful depictions of queerness, and I'm not sure I would like to be usefully depicted.
Yes, maybe not in quite a general, broad sense of useful as a kind of utilitarian argument.
Yeah.
But I guess this is like I think this is a similar problem that where Deleuze comes in. And I mean, there's a critique of representation, and they also use that phrase of the map is not the territory. But I think for them, it's a question of what they are doing with and against Lacan. And I guess maybe to couch this slightly in my own research at the moment that I'm working on my PhD, it will appear disparate, but then it becomes very quickly relevant. My PhD project has been about the figure of the orphan in 20th century French philosophy, primarily from this. It's an essay that I wrote maybe like 2019 that I think has now gone down. The website shut down at some point. But it's this interest that I've long had in the universality of the Oedipus complex for psychoanalysis that kind of forgets the particular experience of Oedipus himself. So you have and what Deleuze and Guattari basically do in Anti-Oedipus, which again is something that I never really talked about, but I think is really interesting. Anti-Oedipus is kind of they're not anti, they're kind of anti a specific reading of Oedipus, which sort of positions the problem that the Oedipus myth represents on its head. So like Lacan in his essay on, I think is it like something about individuals and the family complexes.
Yeah.
He makes this argument about, Oedipus is universal because what that myth represents is the subject's entry into language, into culture, which is universal because none of us are outside of language. We enter the symbolic order, etc., etc. And he always has to make the psychoanalysts always have to make the caveat that this is about the mummy, daddy, me, nuclear family, nuclear heterosexual family. But that because that process of entering into language is universal, that includes, and Lacan makes this diversion, this includes adoptees. So it doesn't matter if you aren't brought up with your biological parents, you're nonetheless entering into a symbolic order. So Oedipus still applies. What's so strange about having to make that caveat is that Oedipus is himself an adoptee. So what actually psychoanalysis is doing is it takes a specific experience of adoption, of displacement, and a questioning of origins that leads to, and then universalizes it. And Freud does this too, where he talks about how, in his essay on the family romance, he sort of, a child comes to realize that they meet other people's parents, they enter a social milieu, they come to understand that their parents aren't the be-all and end-all. They aren't the sole authority. They may, parent children differently to other parents. So they come to question the authority of their parents, and then they have this fantasy that Freud says is quite common, of being a step sibling or a stepchild or being adopted. And what I find so strange about that again is that the adoption becomes a kind of caveat when actually it's been used as a sort of fundamental. And I guess the way that you could presuppose that is that so many of our myths about entering to society are about orphans and adoptees, like Oedipus himself, or like Luke Skywalker, or Harry Potter, or E.T., the extraterrestrial. Like it's all about familial displacement and having to find your own place in the social order anyway. Right. That becomes relevant here because what's interesting for me as someone who is adopted and who is also trans is that trans people are actually overrepresented among adoptees in the general population. So if 1 to 2% of people are trans in general, it's 5 to 6% of adoptees, which considering how, when you actually put numbers together, that's a huge representation. And I guess the question that I've had is like, how would Lacan understand this? And Lacan is obviously quite notorious at this point after Paul Preciado's Can the Monster Speak? for being seen as, you know, as not compatible with theories of transness and queerness, because it explains away what transness is. And at a certain point, that's true, but it's interesting. Where, so for Lacan, I guess you could say that trans people are psychotics in his sense of clinical structure. Psychotic is someone who has a hole in the symbolic order. For Lacan, it's not the name for the father, and that hole has to be filled. Something has to be constructed, which is something that we all do. For Lacan, even the ego is a construction. It's a way that you mediate between your unconscious and the person you understand yourself to be. Rather than that be pejorative, Lacan loves psychotics, and the end of his career is writing about James Joyce, who is again notable here as someone who's trying to navigate a kind of existence out of phase. Finnegan's Wake is this kind of unreadable book, again, a kind of representation of the unrepresentable, that is a kind of Creole of Gaelic and English, and is kind of, it has a sort of sense that you can kind of intuit, because it's kind of, it still responds to a kind of grammar that is recognizable, but none of the words really have much sense making qualities to them. And Lacan loves that and kind of runs off. And I think but for Lacan, then it's this question of that, you know, James Joyce is doing this because he's trying to fill a hole that's not there. He is responding to a lack, and desire is all about lack for Lacan. Deleuze and Guattari come in here because they actually try and find a positive version of this. And they kind of actually take this note about the universality of adoption or orphaning very explicitly in Anti-Oedipus, where they write the unconscious is an orphan. So if we're going to universalize Oedipus and say that, you know, this is a universal experience, it's not that adoptees or orphans are kind of a little, you know, enclosed that needs to be accounted for. The unconscious is itself an orphan. And what do orphans do in our myths? They have to, and I guess as you were saying, like, tell your own stories. You have to construct your own place within the world. And I guess that transness in itself is, you know, psychoanalysis has its own reading, but I think there's a way that you can positivize that for, you know, without, I kind of don't, even speaking personally, I kind of have no interest in trying to, like, hypothesize the reasons for my transness. But there is a sense of it being this kind of positive change and a construction of your own sense of self that maybe, you know, something went awry at some point, but maybe, I don't know, I kind of want to always bracket that because I don't want to psychoanalyze the self. But that's what I see in Deleuze as this kind of positivization of, representing the unrepresentable. And that maybe, like, Deleuze has a critique of representation, but I think as it being a response to Lacan, it's a specific kind of representation. And now I'm rambling, but I don't know what you would make of that kind of valence on things.
Yeah, I mean, speaking quickly, I mean, the reason that I'm trying this is because I wanted to win the Olympics.
How's that going?
Not very well. I'm drinking red wine on a Monday night. Sorry. But so that's fascinating. I think and I think this is maybe what we're going to run up against, which is that I don't like positivity. In many senses. And I think that quite often that kind of where you end up with Deleuze and Guattari's reading of metaphysics, and I think it's probably reading is probably the right word, but to take that figure of psychoanalysis, of the unconscious in psychoanalysis. I mean, this is where my psychoanalytic chops are really going to be shown up. But my sense would be that Deleuze and Lacan, and Guattari as well, Deleuze, Guattari, and Lacan, are all more or less positivistic in their depiction of the relation between the real, which is reconfigured the real with the lowercase r before it gets raised to the uppercase in Lacan, and then placed at the level of the plane of consistency in Deleuze-Guattari, because all of them in some way cast that the relation between the subject and the real as one in which there isn't as much of a gap, or there isn't so much of a negativity as there is a gap, wherein they're kind of ontologically differentiated. Because for Lacan, it's not that you don't know the real. Mm-hmm. It's not that you can't, you can't represent the real, but that's kind of not because. That's because to talk about trying to represent the real would be the wrong question. And there'd be something in the symbolic, I think, where the symbolic would be understood as kind of the structure of representation, which can be sort of, I think, there's a version of, how do I put this? Insofar as Lacan thinks that the symbolic order is something like a transcendental structure of subjectivity, which, although separated as it must therefore be from the real, means that it cannot simply access that real, and that's how you get your negativity in Lacan. It ends up being quite positivistic because it does think that you can draw a diagram of it, and it thinks that there is a logic. There's a logic to this. There is a structure to it which can be depicted, I think, without loss. And my sense is that the problem of representation is not merely that there is something that you lack in representation. It's that actually that it becomes impossible to represent. It becomes impossible to represent even lack. And so the problem of representation runs as deep as to kind of philosophical discourse. And I think this is where the problem comes in. Maybe to bring this back to transition, though, I think for me, the way that I am wanting to think about this goes back to Marx, which is going to be a bit strange, but here we go. And specifically the kind of the moments in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, where Marx talks about the fact, and I think that you can understand Marx's later work through as kind of an attempt to approach this problem of representation. I think that's ultimately what the theory of commodity fetishism is, as the ways in which representation is never your own. That is to say, you're always putting on someone else's mask, even to represent yourself as the figure to whom representation is occurring. So as the person to whom something is being represented. And I would suggest perhaps that the way that I would want to start thinking about queerness and indeed transness would at least be in part as a way of negotiating, as a kind of impossible negotiation in a way, because there's no two sides to this, right? There's no me on the other side of representation, but that would be the problem, and that would be the productivity of the problem. That if there is a negotiation between the symbolic representation, capital, patriarchy, whatever you want to name it, and those that it is seeking to subjectify, there always has to be a dimension there which considers that representation as transmitted as something like a myth. Mm-hmm. And I think the thing that's interesting to me about those figures that you all describe is not so much that it is not just the fact that the orphan appears so importantly, it's that the orphan seems to be an essential structure of myth. Mm-hmm. And there is something about that which seems to be continually historically effective in Nietzsche's sense. So for me, and I've certainly rambled there, I would suggest that reinserting, so if there's a kind of a mythological dimension of something like of Derrida's concept of Horntology, which I sort of hope or think that there is, it might be thought that that would be for me, that would be the place to turn for kind of a new consideration of a philosophy.
Could we just unpack what you mean by the term myth here, just in case if people just think it means just not real? I know you mean that when you say myth, but do you mean a kind of sort of equiprimordial structure or something? Which actually doesn't explain anything, so I said the word equiprimordial structure. So what does myth mean in this context, I think is better to put it.
Well, I'm not sure what myth means in this context. I can tell you what I think I mean by myth, which is that I just think that myth is a narrative which constitutes social value. So narrative, quite broadly understood. I have a more specific understanding of what that could be, but it's something that I've written about before. And yeah, there would be this kind of interesting value, kind of value creating feature of the figure of the orphan, which there's always a kind of a heroism there somehow.
Yeah. Well, I guess there's a. I mean, I think this is how it's understood even for Lacan. He has the neurotic individual myth, where he has the paradox of something being individual and a myth is his version of what Freud calls the family romance, where he understands myth is, Levi-Strauss, myth for Levi-Strauss is kind of like history. It's not it's this, we don't, I think Levi-Strauss has some sort of line that's like, men do not create myth. Myth is sort of told through us. It's kind of like, it's a kind of amorphous collective stories that we tell. Mm-hmm. A myth has no author, no original author. It is a kind of, and I guess, yes, if it has a social value, it is this kind of story that we have long told ourselves. And I guess in the case of the orphan, and especially Oedipus, you could argue that the social value, or maybe not Oedipus, it's slightly more complicated, but in general, it's about it's a story of displacement and then finding your way back into a symbolic order. And I guess there's one other thing that I would say, which is that for Lacan, I don't think that the real is at all just separate from the symbolic.
No, you are right.
Imaginary. And I think it's, you're right about the gap, I think, but it is the whole, but it's it is a kind of positivized whole, and maybe positive actually isn't the right word here. There's kind of lots of different valences we could understand that. But I think this is Geneviève Morel, who's got some books about Lacan, and especially about trans people, that I'm kind of not sure where I stand on them yet. There's a book of hers called The Law of the Mother, and there's a book that precedes it, which is called Sexual Ambiguities, which is very, very, explicitly Lacan reading of trans people. That, I don't know, I think it's problematic in the sense that this is someone theorizing about trans experience who doesn't actually really know what it is. It's like, which is the problem with psychoanalysis in general, right? It's trying to define and explain away an experience that isn't actually have been experienced by the person writing the theory. I think that's a problem that most people can sort of agree that's what's the issue here. But anyway, she has this way of framing what this positive whole in the sense of Lacan's knots and the Borromean knots, because if we think of a length of string, for a piece of string to be knotted, it has to pass through a hole within itself. So that the whole isn't an absence and it's a lack, but it's a kind of lack in having, which is what Lacan would say. The whole is the thing that ties the whole thing together. Yeah. Which again kind of brings us back to this ontological thing, I think, where, I mean, my kind of polemical position on this is that Derrida, Lacan, Deleuze are kind of all seen as kind of very much against one another. I think they all kind of using, they write them. Deleuze and Guattari starts where Lacan ends. Personally, is how I think about their relationship. Derrida, I think, is actually probably the most interesting here because of the way that he talks about, he privileges these experiences of displacement. This is, if I'm talking about the orphan here, and this sort of, this feels like we're maybe moving away from transness. I really don't want to do that. I think if I'm talking about the myths of orphans here, it's how applicable that is to all different kinds of experiences of displacement. whether that is feeling displacement within one's own sense of gender, or it could be, you know, the what different ways that people talk about that kind of experience of displacement, whether it's, you know, being I mean, Deleuze and Guattari talk about this at length in terms of Jewish diaspora, and also Palestine, as if, you know, Jewish diaspora is kind of that story, and how it culminates in the state of Israel is kind of, you know, a displacement that kind of, well, yeah, the kind of anyway. That's kind of a side. I don't want to go on too much of a tangent.
But I think the question here, no, and I'm only doing this because I think that you really do have a point. I think the question is whether it is possible to represent displacement,
right?
Mm-hmm. So, and I think that this is, and what would, and you know, in some ways, right, this is always the question in so much of this thought is, you know, the ways in which you can represent an alleged instability always necessarily within the terms of the symbolic, right, or of representation. And for Butler, right, the whole point is because the way that symbolic is in fact constituted is with this performative dimension, which therefore always in some ways fails.
Yeah.
And like that's the gap, right? That's you know,
this is the other thing too that I kept wanting to come back to, because I think it's the crux of, rather than me rambling. The thing with if it's finding this link between orphans not in myth but in actuality, and this overrepresentation of trans people who are adopted as orphans. And I don't really have much of a proof for this at the moment, but my feeling is that why this orphans in particular are overlooked, and I think also where trans people fit into this, maybe when Lacan says that the psychotic is the person that has a hole in this symbolic order or whatever, I kind of get the feeling that's wrong. And it's actually not. It's not that there's a gap, but I think that what seems to happen in a lot of this theory is that you kind of naturalize this symbolic order in a certain, naturalize again, probably not the right word.
Oh, I think it's exactly the right word.
But or like say, so like you are born into a heteronormative family, and you go through all the experiences, you enter into the symbolic order, and then maybe later, if you're wily enough, you come to question it.
Yeah,
I think why orphans are interesting in the way that they're overlooked in this discourse is that, and they say this as an adoptee, I think you're aware far, far earlier of the way in which these things are constructed and could be constructed differently. You are aware very, very early on, maybe even like that, you know, these parents that you know aren't your real parents, but you are in that kind of symbolic structure of mother, father, and you know that they're not your biological parents, and there's a kind of taboo to that. But you understand that it's kind of this has been something that's been made. It's shorn of all the kind of natural, quote unquote, natural authority of remaining in a biological family. You're aware of how it's that you're aware of the grammar of it and how it is adapted, and how it's kind of like a representation of a normal family for an adoptee is a construction far earlier maybe than people that actually grow up in a regular family. And I think I wonder, in terms of queerness, how that relates. Where, you know, the example that you use in the essay and that Butler uses too around drag.
Yeah.
Is there a sense that for trans people, we are kind of the royal you? No, there's a sense that you kind of understand how strange of a construction gender, or you're aware of its performative nature. And how malleable it is already, where it's you're kind of aware that it's not really authorized by anything, and so you run and play with it.
I think that's part of it, and I think that could explain that. But I think I'm not sure I like this idea that we play with gender. Yeah. I know that we say it quite a lot. I know, well, I don't, but I know that it's said quite a lot. But I think it really does, you know, suggest that you can stand outside of gender and then just fuck about with it from the outside. Yeah. But there's nonetheless a myth told of, you know, not to keep doing that, but you know, you know, where, and so play would be precisely the Derridian concept of that outside to the structure, right? The kind of the famous inaugural essay of his writing, Structure, Sign and Play. And, I'm sure that part of the point of Can the Monster Speak is a reference to the final sentence of that, which is, the monster that is yet to come. It's kind of the best bit in all of Derrida. I think it's really, really good. I mean, maybe
on that point of like again, I think maybe this is the problem that I have in general, that as much as this sounds like it's an explanation for transness, I'm not really interested in that. But I guess it's sort of the problem that arises, kind of going back to where we started, right? Of like, what is it to, if trans people exist, how do they exist?
Yeah.
And I don't know what value is in actually define that at all. But then if it's kind of just an awareness of how, if queerness is somehow differentiated in a sense of knowing, it's being aware of its own construction more so than, is that, I don't know if that's problematic or not.
I think it probably, I mean, if it's problematic, it's probably good that it is. I would suggest that, but I think the thing is, I mean, the reason why this is going to fail, I mean, maybe I wanted to reinsert this, is that I think that there's been quite a lot of theorization about queerness, both from stuff that will call itself queer theory and stuff that wouldn't, that slightly, by virtue of kind of the alleged outsideness of queerness to the kind of matrix of gendered representation, has slightly forgotten gender and certainly sex as kind of a dynamic of this, which maybe that's precisely what defines it. So it's not transness's play that defines it. It's precisely, the fact that it's the potentially maybe more its object of play, and that then the description of that object of what gender is and what sex is can plausibly be lost, not in general, but sometimes I feel it gets lost in these proclamations of the kind of political radicality of queerness, because I think to an extent they've forgotten the politics that they're meant to be radical about, which is to say, or if it's not been forgotten, then I think it's been assumed, and I mean, this is why I think more and more people are calling themselves transsexual, not because of any kind of, I mean, partially because it's chic, but also I think partially because it potentially reinserts the kind of the specificities of the trans experience, which do not legitimize it as and against other kind of less specific concepts, right?
Yeah.
But rather just might therefore shed new light on their constitution. I would say that things like the problem of representation, if transness has a specific relationship to things like representation, to myth in general, it's surely going to be in its relationship to psychosexual development in various forms. And you could think that something like the Oedipus myth, and this is I'm surely not the first person to think something like this, and there's probably a citation that I should be giving, but you could think that something like the Oedipus myth is reflective of the kind of loss, precisely the loss of myth to the individual, the fact that you were always constituted by something that you can't describe.
Yes.
Which in a way, for Derrida, that's Horntology, right? That's what he means by it, which comes precisely out of his reading of the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, right? This fact that, that you do not make your history as you please, and nor do you make your gender as you please, right? I mean, potentially so if I may, if you liked, and this may not hold up to much scrutiny, but one avenue perhaps would be to think of it like this, where the relationship between transition and adoption might be not so much the awareness of the construction of something, but rather the kind of the already feeling of already being aware of your constitution by something which you have lost.
Yes.
Which would be a feature of all human existence. I think this is like dialectic of enlightenment 101, is that it's all like fate and the subject.
That's also Lacan's reading of the Oedipus complex.
Right.
It's like it's not simply that you enter into the symbolic as a the symbolic order as a kind of arbitrary thing. He calls it, it's as if you are subjected to the insistence of the signifying chain, as if there is a meaning already here that you are then kind of forced to adhere to, or you learn how to behave within the context of language, whatever. That's but I think that's there. I think that you're right. I think that's actually a much better way of phrasing it. Actually, I did have a thought actually on this issue of representation, and maybe this kind of the problematic usage of sex and gender.
Yeah.
How are we for time? Actually,
We've gone for just about an hour, so we got some more time. Don't worry.
Cool.
Now we can sneak in the real shit.
Maybe this is like bringing it back to like a kind of, because I feel like I mean we said that we wanted this to be a very philosophical chat.
Yeah.
But I'm also kind of like there was actually a comment on my piece, my response to you. I don't know if you saw it. It was by someone called Alice Rowe.
Yes.
That was kind of talking about how this is these questions that we're having are just to kind of just getting philosophical about it, and that this isn't really necessarily an important or interesting question, but actually, I mean, that's not doing justice to it. It was actually a fantastic comment, and if people have been following this, well, back and forth, it's 2 so far. That's something that I want to try and respond to elsewhere. But what was coming to mind in terms of this problem of representation, how this is reflected of, I guess, queer people, trans people, the complexity of these philosophical questions is important, maybe is because of the ways that we are protesting at present end up falling into really muddy territory. And I know that in the context of, for both of us, I think it was, I noticed the same thing, and I read it in your article, and it kind of was what actually helped me in, was this equivalency between like different forms of solidarity for different positions, and then you kind of lose the particularities. I don't know if you saw a protest that happened today or yesterday in Scotland.
Yeah, I did.
Where it was trans women doing a topless protest.
Yeah.
I'm curious as to how you. I think. I mean, and then this is my. I'm trying to think about what the intention of that protest is, and for me, I'm kind of assuming that it's like the presumption is that trans women are just men in dresses, that you are very visibly a man and you change your clothes or something. And I guess what's interesting, there's always this turf denial of actually what the physical changes that transition can do to your body if you transition hormonally. What I'm kind of getting, there was the point of this protest, was that to try and illustrate that, to have topless trans women showing these secondary sexual characteristics that are there and undeniable. And I'm wondering whether that's actually a helpful way in the context of this conversation of representation.
I thought it was really good.
Okay. Yeah.
But I thought it was, I mean, I read it in a different way. It's because I knew that if it be reported, they would have to censor it.
Right, yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And that was the smart thing, was sort of like, it was, I think, I mean, which I'm not sure whether it sort of would, I'm not sure how it would fit into this kind of vague theoretical architecture that I've sort of briefly settled upon. But I thought that if it did, it reminded me of the "It's Okay to Cry" music video, which Sophie did almost in a different way, which was in which her tits are just not censored on that video, which is like so interesting. I mean, and I think, and that was certainly like a play with sort of at least the always normative aspects of what is deemed representable.
Yeah.
Right. And there's something here, psychoanalytically about censorship, I'm sure. And I thought that potentially what was so great about that protest was it's sort of inheritance of the previous topless protests in feminist history, kind of a reinsertion of trans women into that history. I think most political movements that have any success, place themselves in a lineage. And I think that in some ways is why transphobia in the UK has been so successful, is because it has managed to place itself quite successfully in this lineage of British feminism, which is, by the way, intended to be a criticism of British feminism, not a legitimation of purpose of applause, which is to say, suffragettes, the suffragettes, proximity to various forms of fascism and conservatism, and probably still hasn't been thoroughly recognized. But what I also think it was productive about that protest, was precisely the fact that, I mean, certainly the reports that I saw of it censored their brands.
Yeah, the ones I saw too.
Right, from the perspective of patriarchy, rightly so, right? Because that fits.
Yeah.
But I saw something like insane comment on social media about this, where it's like, content warning for transphobia. So there's no need to censor them because, like, you don't need to censor men's chests, which just felt like completely impotent statement, because it's like, it's just, and it's like, a real, and I think if anything, was that trans comedian who stripped on live TV?
Oh yes,
I forget her name, but anyway,
Jordan Gray.
Yeah, that's right. It was Jordan Gray.
I mean, it's such a fucking earful from remembering that.
And I thought, maybe. Oh God, maybe I just think that we should all be taking our tops off more out of principle. But yeah.
But is that maybe an example of like this kind of, that's effective because it kind of reflects the sort of ridiculousness of a sort of a symbolizing construction of like you end up putting your enemy, you end up putting your TERFs into this ridiculous paradox here and sort of exacerbating it.
I think so. I think that's surely got to be it. It's got to be something about the ways in which the trans body is interpreted in these various conflicting normative ways, right? As always both male and female, and playing with that.
And I think maybe that's, I mean, I don't know whether to do, maybe this is painfully on brand to try and do like a Deleuzean reading of that sort of protest or something.
It's fine, I'll do an Adornian one.
Yeah. But I wonder if that's kind of that is this, I often wonder if there's, I mean, it's a book that I've read it a year ago and it's immediately gone out of my head. I think it's a book called Deleuze and the Critique of Representation, which reads that critique that he has through feminist politics and feminist art. And that might be a moot reference point because it might not actually have anything to do with what I'm trying to say, but I feel like if there's a vibe in the deeper recesses of my memory where I guess that is one way in which representation is called into question, but not I guess this is the way in which a certain kind of representation is insisted upon, and where the logic of that representation actually breaks down, not in general as representation as a whole. And I think this is I think this is kind of the fault of Deleuze and Guattari actually using Artaud for a lot of their stuff.
Yeah.
Like, Artaud's ridiculous. It's kind of the fun of it because he's someone that's against all sort of derivation. He just wants to try and imagine himself as a person not born of any sort of body. It's like it's truly an impossible kind of task of poetry that if you actually looked at it in terms of a logic and how useful that would be, it's ridiculous. There's kind of no point to it. But then what comes out of the attempt anyway, and I guess it's what it does is it calls into question or even highlights the supposed inescapability of a certain politics of representation that actually, when taken to its limit, breaks down anyway. Which I guess is maybe what I'm seeing this protest doing.
It's got to be it. I mean, I think something like it's going to have. I think if there's a kind of a version of a trans or a queer politics on its way, is going to have to continue to talk about the ways in which transness can never be depicted. It's going to have to continue sort of attempting to depict, I think, that represent that failure of representation and that's why in some ways I thought it was a really good work of art, that protest, because insofar as quite a lot of good works of art, especially the modernist ones, are about the inability to depict the subject, not in the Kantian sense, but just the subject of the painting. And I think that if maybe I should have said this at the start, I think that queerness has become a little bit too sure of itself. And I think for a while we were all quite sure of ourselves, and even if we were understood as sure of our uncertainty, I think that there is in some ways a kind of maybe a more radical way of living and living in and experiencing that uncertainty that really is at the heart of a lot of this. I mean, this is what I end the essay on, was this quote from Butler's, giving an account of oneself which is about this kind of a failure to live up to norms, even the norm of anti-normativity.
Yeah.
And the fact that, that the situation of the historical, of being historical beings is this kind of being cut off from that which made you what you are.
Yeah.
And I think that if there is one thing that trans people know about, it is that feeling of being cut off from what you once were.
Yeah.
And transness might be, albeit a failed representation of that cut. But nonetheless, the way that I think I'm at least going to try and think of myself, and the way that I think may be powerful for us to start thinking about ourselves, is always failing even to depict our own failure to live up to norms. Right, the ways in which we still become normative, being aware of those and consistently and change and really changing them, and then we really might start to have an unstable version of queerness or an unstable version of transition.
I guess it's that maybe with that protest still in mind, it's kind of that if that is a protest that humiliates powers, especially state powers, desire to, well, it shows how the logic of representation breaks down. It's as if that tactic is for too long run the other way. Whereas it's queer people that have sought to display a kind of certainty. I mean, I guess this is something I mentioned in my piece too. That, being coached by friends in how best to go about acquiring hormones through the NHS, and always being like, it doesn't matter even if you identify as non-binary now, or you don't know, or try and get rid of all uncertainty. Say you have never been more sure of the fact that you are a woman, and that's the only way that you will get this. Even if that's not true, there is a pressure to conform to a certain image of what a trans person is. And that seems to have been, that's for a time that was strategic, or maybe it still is for a lot of people, but kind of sense in the culture. And the way that trans people talk about themselves and about each other sometimes, because we're not all, some people aren't always, there are lots of examples of trans people hating on other trans people, but that's kind of just a virtue of, I guess, the difficulty of the position that we're in, sadly. But you can sort of see how that drive for certainty and almost an essentialism, an essential queerness, or a certain essential transness, has in the other direction, has kind of humiliated the logic of our own ways of thinking about ourselves. And now we've been on the back foot. And maybe it is a case of turning that protest is a great example of what happens when you let you humiliate that uncertainty for state power, and not do what we can to build up or at least avoid allowing them to do the same to us.
I mean, it's what Adorno says about the artwork in aesthetic theory, and maybe this is a good example, is where, so Adorno has this really interesting reading of the ways in which artwork fails to be autonomous, but so autonomous, that is to say, outside of the social, right, and also fails to conform to its own law. And ultimately, to boil it down to kind of a sentence, the whole point is that artworks appear to speak to you as if they're saying something, but you look at them and you think, well, that's just, but really they're just material configurations, kind of in occasionally quite hodgepodge sorts of ways. And the kind of the political power of artwork for Adorno ends up being the fact that it seems to speak as this kind of Kantian liberal subject that's absolutely autonomous, and yet is just a hodgepodge of lots of different things that comes together, sort of dissolves your own identity insofar as you are revealed to yourselves, to set yourself be as much of a hodgepodge of various expressions that somehow, for whatever reason, appear to look like a person. And I would suggest that possibly if there's a politics of transness, it would be an artistic, or I should be careful not to say an aestheticization of politics, but it would be an artistic politics perhaps that would reinsert the theatrical dimension of performance in gender, that would would reveal that other people were reading from a script just as much as trans people were.
Yeah.
That would be and we are reading from scripts.
Yeah. It's that old, like, is it like an old New York Times cartoon, the one that's kind of always trotted out, kind of like a liberal meme at this point, where it's like someone pointing at a work of a Pollock-esque modern art piece and going, what does this represent? And the painting shouts back, what do you represent?
Very good.
But that whole, but the fact that the same question is sort of, it's as if the artwork is defying when it's really just an echo. I've seen that cartoon so much that I sort of thought it was just a bit like we live in a society, but actually you've given its power back with a bit of a doornail.
Having not known what it was, actually.
Yeah. That's great. Yeah.
All right.
I mean, sorry,
I think sign off there. Maybe cut my bit about the cartoon.
No, I like the cartoon.
No, the cartoon is an excellent cartoon. I think it was at least done in the same style, if not by the same person who illustrated a lot of Wilhelm Reich's books, I think. The illustration looks exactly the same as the book Listen, Little Man, which is Reich's. I mean, most of Reich's work can be quite ranty, but this is his most rantiest We Live in a Society book. No, I mean, I said we already come up to about an hour 15. I mean, I don't want to take up any much more of our collective time. I've just been glad to facilitate this discussion, honestly, because they were two really fantastic pieces. And I mean, whilst we could pitch our respective books, they are owned by a bunch of genocidal Zionist cunts. So I'm not going to recommend. I recommend you steal all of our books, and of course you can find them at the usual places. And of course we will link both your pieces down below. I also want to give them a shout out to Splinter Mag.
Yeah, shout out Splinter Mag.
Yeah, who commissioned Billie to do the piece, and there are loads of other cool pieces up on there. More coming, of course, soon, derived from the excellent dictum from Adorno that the splinter in one's eye is the best magnifying glass, although it fucking hurts quite a lot. I guess in terms of, I guess there's obviously a few more events coming. I just also want to do some quick sub plugs before we get to some more plugs. So Billie mentioned the confluence between sort of various kinds of fascism and the suffragettes, and we're actually doing an episode on this soon with Alex Charnley and Michael Richmond on their new book Fascism and the Woman's Cause, coming out from our good friends at Ebb Press. And I know you both have some events coming up too, actually. So do you want to finish on some plugs?
Yeah, I don't know whether it's officially announced yet, but it will be soon, so I suppose it's fine. On the 9th of June, I'm going to be speaking with Jules Gleeson about her new book Hermaphrodite Logic at Houseman's on Caledonian Road in London. Yeah, come down. Houseman's is always fun.
And if you can't make that, we've got an episode coming up with Jules in a few weeks. Mattie, what's going on?
I'm also going to be at Cafe Otto on Tuesday, 24th of June, for the third in a series of events hosted by the Wire magazine, looking at the impact of AI on contemporary music. I'm going to be talking about Ontology, Salvage Punk, Accelerationism, with performances by Lorraine Lichtenberg, Elaine Michner, and also Vicky Bennett, aka People Like Us. Yeah, that's the 24th of June.
Folks, if you're in London, get out to these. There'll be recordings of some, and we'll try and keep updated as best we can. And we'll say thanks everyone for listening, and thank you to Billie and Mattie for joining me today.